Here's our first PC build at TrysumTech. How's it look? You think it has enough RGB? Welcome to TrysumTech. On today's show, we will be building our first gaming PC. I'm real excited for today's video as this is my first ever PC build. Let's go through the parts list for this budget gaming PC. First up, we got the Intel i7-8700K, 6 cores, 12 threads, boost clock of 4.7 gigahertz. We're going to be pairing the 8700K with the Z390 AORUS Ultra motherboard from GIGABYTE. This board supports 8th and 9th gen Intel processors. It comes with a front USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C header, as well as triple M2 slots, all with thermal guards. Powering up this build will be the GameMax VP600 RGB 600 watt power supply. It has an 80 plus bronze rating and it should be more than enough for this budget build. Next up, we have storage. We're going to be installing 2 SSD drives and 1 hard drive in this build. First up, we have the 500GB SSD drive from SK Hynix, the Gold S31. Next, we have the crucial BX500 240GB SSD drive. And finally, we have the 2TB Seagate Barracuda 3.5-inch hard drive. Cooling is going to be handled by a company called darkFlash. First, we have 3 DR12 Pro 120mm double ring RGB case fans. Then we have another 3-pack of the CS140 140mm case fans. These also have an RGB ring, but only on one side. And finally, we're using the Shadow, a top flow cooler with, you guessed it, an RGB ring as well. For memory, we're going to be using 16GB of G.SKILL TridentZ DDR4 memory running at 3600 MHz. And finally, for the GPU, we're going to be using the GTX 1660 Ti Gaming X from MSI. It has 6GB of GDDR6 memory, boost clock of 1875 MHz. All these components will be going into the black ThermalTake H200TG RGB mid-tower case. It has a tempered glass on one side, PSU shrouded and RGB light bar on the front panel. It can support a 240mm radiator on the top and either 240 or 280 radiator on the front. So I decided to stream the PC build, but unfortunately I was using a laptop and Wi-Fi. The stream was very choppy and laggy, as you can see. I'm fast forwarding through the build process to make it seem a little bit more fluid. First thing was to take apart the case. I removed the tempered glass, the back panel, the front panel, the drive cage that was located in the PSU shroud, the rear 120mm fan, and the accessory box that was also inside the case. The second step is installing the CPU on the motherboard. Intel CPUs have notches on either side of the chip that correspond with tabs on the socket. You want to line up the CPU with the socket using the notches and tabs as your guide. Gently place the CPU in the socket. Be careful not to damage any of the contact pins. Then close the latch, pull the fastener arm down, and lock in place. Now that we have the CPU installed, we can go ahead with installing the CPU cooler. Make sure you select the right bracket, as many coolers come with Intel and AMD brackets. Once you located the correct bracket, go ahead and apply enough thermal compound to the CPU and proceed to attach the CPU cooler to the motherboard with the 4 screws provided. Next up is RAM. Please refer to your motherboard manual to find the correct DIMM slots to install the memory. Once you confirm where to install the memory, line up the notch on the memory with the tab on the DIMM slot and insert the memory into the DIMM slot. The memory can only go in one way. Please do not try to force it. You will hear a click once it's installed correctly. Next up were the case fans. I installed the 3 140mm fans first. 2 fans went at the top of the case and 1 went at the rear. These will be set up as exhaust fans to dispense the heat from inside the case. Then we move on to the 3 120mm fans. These will be going in the front panel as intake fans to bring in fresh air from outside the case. All the fan cables will be plugged into an 8-port fan hub. This hub connects to your motherboard RGB header if it has one. This will allow the fan's RGB lights to be controlled by the motherboard RGB software or via remote control that was provided with the fans. After all the fans were installed, I moved on to the power supply. This is a semi-modular power supply. This means the 24-pin power connector and the 8-pin CPU power connector cannot be disconnected from the power supply. But other cables like the SATA power and the Molex cables can be disconnected as needed. I installed the PCU inside the PCU shroud and screwed into place with the provided screws. Next was to install the 2TB hard drive as well as the SSD drives. The hard drive was installed in a hard drive cage that was located in the PSU shroud, so that's why it's not visible. The SSD drives are installed using SSD sleds. The SSD drives are attached to the SSD sleds, then the SSD sled slides into place inside the case and are held by a thumb screw. So it was getting late into the night when I was going to try and put in the motherboard, so I decided just to go to sleep and continue the next day. The next day I started to install the motherboard but ran into an issue with the top and rear fans. The RAM was a little too tall and hitting the top case fans. I had to remove the top and rear fans in order to have some clearance. I proceeded to install the motherboard in place and then reinstall the fans. In retrospect, I will install the motherboard into the case right after the CPU and memory have been installed on the motherboard. This helped me avoid any clearance issues with fans, radiators, or any other components. Also, this helps with cable routing as well. Once all the fans were reinstalled, I started working on wiring and cable management. One of the first things I did was connect all the fans to the fan hub. Next, I started going through the front panel headers and connecting them to the motherboard. Remember to always refer to your motherboard manual to locate the correct location for the front panel headers. Next, I connected the front audio panel cable to the motherboard. After that, I had to run SATA and Molex cable from the PSU to the SSD and hard drives, as well as the fan hub. After that, we connected the USB front panel header to the motherboard. Next up was I needed to connect the 24-pin to the motherboard, as well as the CPU power 8-pin to the motherboard. I did not use cable extensions as this was my first build and I kind of forgot. I did order some cable extensions which we will see in another video. Lastly, I connected the PCIe cable to the PSU. This will power the GPU. I made sure to double check all my wiring and connections. The last piece of the build is the graphics card, the MSI 1660 Ti GameMax. All you need to do is locate your PCIe slot and firmly press the graphics card into place until you hear a satisfying clicking noise. The click means the card was installed correctly. At this point, I did some final cable management to make sure everything was plugged in correctly. Finally, I'm ready to power up the PC for the first time. I pressed the power button and nothing happened. I forgot to turn on the power supply. So I turned on the power supply and pressed the power button again and the PC turned on. I did not show it in the video, but the PC did post. I was so excited for my first build. I started playing with all the different lighting effects the fans had. Unfortunately, I did not run any benchmarks on the build. I will try to include those on future build videos. I hope you enjoyed watching the video. I had tons of fun building a PC, and I'm already working on other builds as we speak. Please comment below on your first PC building experience. Remember to hit that like and subscribe in order to not miss out on future videos. I'm your host, Steve Recluse, and remember, don't be afraid to try some tech.